So the championship structure then. Obviously in the past couple of years within the GAA, and even last year in particular, the championship structure, the structure of the Gaelic football, the All-Ireland Senior Football Championship has very much been in discussion. It's a big topic of conversation in the last couple of years, and it's certainly something that us as fans, pundits, players, everybody has very much been speaking about in the last couple of seasons. As we very well know, this season in 2023, we had a new championship structure that came in that was completely different to anything that we've seen before. The league very much combined with the championship. Obviously, Tailteann Cup, the second year of that as well. But the big thing was obviously the group stages. The group stages came in the All-Ireland Senior Football Championship, something completely new. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just go back and have a look at the 2023 All-Ireland Senior Football Championship. I might even throw an image up on screen of some of the different group stages of how they worked. But usually in previous seasons, how it would work in the All-Ireland Senior Football Championship is that you would have your provincial championships and your provincial winners would go straight on into the All-Ireland quarterfinals, and then the rest would very much have to battle it out in the qualifiers. Now, I was never really I never really had an issue with the qualifiers personally. I think some of the biggest GA moments we've had down the years have been in qualifiers. I think we've seen huge amount of shocks, trills and spills in the qualifiers, but I think it is fair to say we have had a lot of very one-sided games in the qualifiers, and in some ways I think maybe a change was needed. I think with the fact that obviously the Tailteann Cup would come in, obviously in 2022, there was very much this need for, okay, well, you have your Tailteann Cup, which is obviously your 16 teams, and then you have your 16 teams obviously in the All-Ireland Senior Football Championship as well. Whatever way those teams obviously go into their respective championships is obviously done through the league, and we obviously got to see what it looked like in full flow this year as opposed to last year, which is obviously knockout. This year was in fact the group stages. Now, about a year ago I made a video on the channel titled "The New Championship Structure is a Mess," basically. I'll throw an image of it up on screen. And I was very apprehensive about this year's championship structure, the 2023 All-Ireland Senior Football Championship structure, mainly because of the fact that I looked at the group stages and I thought the fact that 3 teams are going to progress from each group, in my opinion, seems a little bit silly. Do you know that way? Like the fact that a team could essentially lose 3 championship games in a row, win on the final day, and then progress into the preliminary round just seemed a little bit silly and potentially unfair on some other sides who've put in more work but end up in the same stage as the All-Ireland Championship. And I think that was always the concern for me, and that was always a bit of the worry, was that you could have a situation where certain teams are losing multiple games, but then still somehow end up progressing to the same stage as the All-Ireland Championship as some other teams. But do you know what the thing is? Once we got to see it in full flow, once we got to see the games, and once we got to see exactly how it worked, to be honest, I quickly changed my mind. I was quickly like, do you know what it is? First of all, it removes dead rubbers. I think dead rubbers are gone within that format in terms of the 3 teams progressing. I think we've seen that every team had something to play for. I think maybe Barron Clare had something to play for going into the final day of those group stages. And do you know what? Like it did bring out some very entertaining games, and you had some big moments towards the end of the group stage with Westmeath drawing with Tyrone. We obviously had Kildare beating Roscommon, which was a huge shock. Cork beating Mayo as well. If you had just the top 2 going through from each group, I'm not entirely sure you get some of those results. For example, I think Westmeath would have already been gone at that point. Cork still would have been in the mix, but I don't think you would have got the same level of entertainment all across the board. And I think that's what made it extremely fascinating and extremely interesting. Of course, there was the argument, and I was one of the people putting ahead one of these arguments was that the provincial championships, and I think provincial championships are for me the big problem within the GAA. I think if you're from Ulster, you've no problem with the Ulster Championship. That championship is absolutely perfect because you have so many teams at a similar standard, and it's always entertaining and it always delivers full value for money. Connacht Championship is somewhat lopsided in the sense that you've got 3 very good teams and then you've got 3 sides who are around Division 3, Division 4. Sligo have obviously hugely improved last season, and maybe they'll be able to bridge the gap on the other 3 teams a little bit more. So Munster Championship is very one-sided in Kerry's favour. I know they've had the odd year where they've messed it up, but generally speaking, Kerry are by far the best side in that province. And Leinster Championship, we know all the issues with Dublin having won that championship 13 seasons in a row. So for me, like with the group stages and everything else, I was thinking it might actually devalue provincial championships somewhat. I think we saw last year that actually wasn't the case. You know, you look at scenes in Derry Armagh. It's still very much there. Clare beating Cork, for example, in the Munster Championship. So, yeah, I think last year's championship structure was very, very good. And I suppose the question is now, should we change anything going into next year? And I suppose that is the title of the video, and that's sort of what I want to gauge some of you lads' opinions on it is, should we change anything going into the All-Ireland Senior Football Championship? Now, I know with the Hurling Championship, there's certainly a lot of changes that can be made and everything else, and we'll certainly discuss that in another video. But looking at it primarily on football and focusing on football for a minute, should we change anything? I think the group stages, for me, looking at it last year, were very entertaining. Look, in some ways you could argue it could be a little bit silly to potentially have sides progressing in third place. But I think at the end of the day, if third place teams go through and then they win their preliminary qualifier and they go on a run, they deserve it. You know, they deserve it because they've turned it around. And in some ways it's actually, quite interesting to see those type of things happen. I think provincial championships are the main thing though, and certainly one thing I would change personally is if you look at the ladies football championship and you look at the format in that football championship in terms of the provincial championships, it's seeded. So you've got Division 1 and Division 2 sides in some of the various different championships, and it's completely seeded. And for that way, you nullify some absolute one-sided hammerings that we see in the early parts of provincial championships every year. Like last year, Dublin versus Laois, Kerry versus Tipperary. Like, did we need to see those games? No, we didn't. Even Galway versus Sligo somewhat in the Connacht final. Like, don't get me wrong, fair play to Sligo for having the season that they had. But it made no sense that being the Connacht final. Like, let's be honest, that is not the two best teams in the Connacht Championship. And it made absolutely zero sense for that to be the final. And I think in previous years as well, where you've had Munster finals, like Kerry versus Clare as well. Like, fair enough, Clare beat Cork, and you give them full credit for that. And maybe on the basis of the Munster Championship, they were the second best team because they beat Cork. But I do think at the same time, we need to start seeding provincial championships. And for me, when we look at provincial championships, it should be Division 1 and Division 2 sides. That should who should be in each provincial championship. That way you'll keep the Ulster Championship as competitive as it is, because you've already got Division 1 and Division 2 sides primarily very much occupying Ulster. I know Down are in Division 3, Antrim are in Division 3 as well. But look, it should be up to those counties to get out of their division. It should be up to those counties to say, look, do you know what? We need to get out of our provincial championship, or we need to get out of our league to get into the senior provincial championship. And that will provide some motivation as well for teams. And I think in Leinster then, when you look at it, you'll have Dublin, Meath, Kildare, Louth. Like, realistically, Dublin aren't going to lose the Leinster Championship anytime soon. But if there was a case where they were going to slip up, it would be, you'd have to imagine one of Meath, Kildare, Louth have obviously shown a good bit of improvement over the last couple of years. And then when you look at Connacht, I think it should be the same as well. Now, the only argument with that is you're removing the potential of an upset. You're removing that shock. You're removing that moment that Tipperary created in 2020. You're removing that moment that Cavan created in 2020. What I would say is those moments are very few and far between when you look back through the history of the GAA. We've had some huge shocks, we've had some huge spills, and there's some great moments in there, but they are very, very few and far between. And it's a tricky one, because if we were to take some of those sides out of provincial championships, then essentially you're taking them out of the championship altogether, because they won't be in the All-Ireland series. But I just think if we were to seed provincial championships, we would remove that element of complete just silly one-sided matches, or maybe something we could do is seed the big teams. So at least then, some of the smaller teams will still get to play, but they'll be playing teams of their own standard until a certain stage of the competition. I think that's something we should be looking at, in my opinion, going into next year and going in beyond that. I think something else that I would like to see is the championship to be a little bit more spaced out going into next season. I think there is an argument that for certain counties who are in much weaker provinces, the likes of Dublin and Kerry, for example, who don't have to be at full strength throughout their provincial championships. Those counties do have more of an advantage, in my opinion, than teams like Mayo, Galway, Roscommon, or even the sides in Ulster like Armagh, Derry, Tyrone. Sides like that, Monaghan as well, who have to play higher standard week in, week out. They have to be more on their game. They have to be more fit. They have to be more sharp to prevent, obviously, being beaten. And I think, as we saw last season, the likes of Mayo, the likes of Galway, the likes of Roscommon, a lot of teams in Ulster as well, playing a lot of very competitive games in their province. And by the time it got to the knockout stages of the All-Ireland series, they fell flat on their faces because they were playing so many intense games. Dublin and Kerry realistically only ever had to worry about peaking until the later parts of the group stage and obviously the All-Ireland knockout series. So I think that's something I would like to see, is just a bit more of a gap now. Do you push the All-Ireland series back out to August? They're obviously discussing that at the moment. They're discussing the fact that they might be cancelling the league finals. Personally, I like the league finals. I think the league finals give us something. They give days out in Croke Park for teams, and I think it's important for that. I do get the fact there's no meaning and everything else, and if they were to go, and if that was to be a sacrifice of it, then fair enough. But the way I would look at it is there should be a bit more, the championship should be a bit more spread out. And I think having the final in the middle part of August and, spreading out the All-Ireland series just a little bit more, especially with preliminary qualifiers and everything else. You looked at it for Mayo, they were in a tough group, weren't they, in terms of Cork, Louth, Kerry. Like, don't get me wrong, you would expect Mayo to beat teams like Cork and Louth on more than one days. But coming through Connacht, coming through so many intense matches, it did catch up on them. And I think if there had been a bit more of a gap, I'm not saying Mayo would have done anything now. Still think Dublin would have beaten them. But I do think maybe you might have seen Mayo, Tyrone just be a little bit more competitive. And I think that's something we should be looking towards. It's going to be interesting. Let me know, should we change anything going into next year's championship structure? It's always a topic of conversation. It's always a topic of debate. I think for myself personally, in terms of the overall structure, in terms of the actual All-Ireland series, the group stages, the knockout series, I wouldn't change anything personally there. I would give it another year to see how it is. But in terms of the provincial championships, that's the big thing. I think we should be looking to seed them. And at the end of the day, that should give the motivation for counties in Division 3 and 4 to be like, do you know what? Let's raise our standards here. And realistically, how often do we see Division 3 and 4 sides win provincial championships? Very, very rarely. Very, very rarely. I think what happened in 2020 was a complete anomaly when you think about it. You go back to the 90s with Clare, Leitrim. I don't even know if those sides were Division 3 teams back then, but generally it very, very rarely happens. It very, very rarely happens. So I think that's something we should look to do. Let me know your thoughts, your opinions in the comments down below. Leave a like and subscribe. I'll speak to you all soon.